Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. There were some controversial comments from new Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, and it involves those who remain unvaccinated. Around 177 Ukrainian refugees fleeing the war with Russia were reunited with loved ones in Newfoundland. And a special memorial ride is being planned in Lethbridge this weekend for a motorcyclist who was killed in a tragic collision last week.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. Premier Danielle Smith offered up some details on health reform, including the fact that Alberta's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Dina Hinshaw, will be replaced. She also said that unvaccinated people were discriminated against more than any other group in her lifetime. She talks about the impact of that discrimination on our healthcare system.
A lot of that problem was created by policies at Alberta Health Services of having mandatory vaccinations. So it prevented us from being able to hire back everyone who had been let go up until about 2.5 months ago when Cabinet directed them to end the mandate. It prevented us from being able to graduate students across the full range of professions because they also had vaccine mandates. It prevented us from being able to hire from other jurisdictions. Through the full range of people who would have otherwise wanted to come here because of vaccine mandates. So they actually, at the management level, made things even worse for our front line.
Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson says the comments from Premier Smith about how the unvaxxed in our province were discriminated against will resonate with many Albertans, but will also upset a number of others.
Obviously, Danielle Smith rode a wave to power that was in large part sort of fueled by the sentiment of the unvaccinated and concerns over how the unvaccinated were treated. But this, I think, is fairly clearly an early sort of misstep. Obviously, there are people who agree with her, people who disagree with her. But I don't know if that's exactly how a person wants to start their very first day as premier, sort of on the back foot a little bit over some of these comments. So we'll have to see how this shakes out. We'll have to see if there's an apology. We'll have to see if she clarifies these remarks in the days ahead. But a bit of a starting out with a bang, I guess you could say, in her tenure as premier.
Mr. Tyler Dawson will also explain how the province is planning on restructuring AHS. You'll have details coming up after business news. Now, since her comment on the unvaxxed being discriminated against, Premier Danielle Smith released a statement on Twitter Wednesday afternoon clarifying her comments. In a tweet, she said, "Yesterday, I made comments regarding the discrimination unvaccinated individuals have suffered through during the past couple of years. My intention was to underline the mistreatment of individuals who chose not to be vaccinated and were punished by not being able to work, travel, or in some cases, see loved ones. I want to be clear that I did not intend to trivialize in any way the discrimination faced by minority communities and other persecuted groups both here in Canada and around the world." Elections Alberta has called a by-election for November 8th in Brooks Medicine Hat. That's the constituency where Premier Danielle Smith says she intends to seek a seat. Smith, who succeeded Jason Kenney as leader of the UCP, does not yet have a seat at the legislature. Brooks Medicine Hat became vacant when the current representative Michaela Fry resigned on Friday. The next general election is slated for May 29th. Smith has said she will not call an earlier vote. Dr. Christopher Essex is a professor at Western University in London, Ontario. He says there's too much virtue science taking place in Canada right now. Dr. Essex says when scientists share views on vaccines or climate change that go against government narratives, they appear to get ostracized or even canceled. He says that's not healthy when you want to have an open and healthy discussion.
What is causing a lot of the problems we have right now, where we have these policies which are, I think, bordering on insanity. They're just kind of driven by people feeling that this is the right thing to do. By golly, we've got to do it right away. That kind of mentality. The reason why this stuff exists is that we're not really ever giving the science a reflection of its unsettled kind of nature. So you don't get to give a fair hearing to any scientist but the ones that happen to be just promoting your particular political agenda.
Dr. Essex also co-wrote a book on the subject entitled Taken by Storm, and he'll share the details with BCN's Jeanette Rocher coming up in the second half of our newscast. Lethbridge MP Rachel Thomas has been named as the Shadow Minister for Canadian Heritage. Thomas says she's honored to be part of the Conservative Shadow Cabinet under the leadership of Pierre Poilievre. She says her focus will be on preserving Canadians' rights and freedoms guaranteed in the Charter, along with ensuring that it is Canadians and not special interest groups who are best served by any legislation that moves forward.
I think that my main focus going forward will be to advocate on behalf of Canadians and making sure that their charter rights are respected. In particular, we're potentially looking at 3 pieces of legislation that are a direct attack on people's freedom around freedom of speech. And so I'll be doing all that I can to hold these pieces of legislation at bay and to advocate for Canadians and for their right to speak freely and to engage freely, to express themselves freely. Because this is a part of what it is to be Canadian, and all other freedoms rest on freedom of speech. And so it is absolutely essential for me to contend for this. And of course, I'll be doing that with the help of my caucus.
Thomas has served as Lethbridge MP since she was first elected back in 2015, and she will officially become the critic to current Canadian Heritage Minister Pablo Rodriguez. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau pledged continued military and humanitarian support to Ukraine after Russian airstrikes killed more civilians.
The Russians' missile strikes on civilians, on innocent people commuting to work, kids playing in parks, are targeted at civilians and civilian infrastructure. There's no military targets in there. It's just a recognition that Ukrainians have fought so bravely, and the world has stood so solidly by their sides and behind them, that Russia's decided to take this to the next level, attack innocents. We remain committed to holding this Russian regime to account and to supporting Ukraine, including financial, humanitarian, sanctions, and military assistance.
Around 177 Ukrainian refugees fleeing Russian attacks in their country have landed in Newfoundland. While there were joyful tears and hugs as families were reunited, there was also a sadness as some reflected on the recent strikes launched against Ukraine by Russia.
The best feeling to be together, really, the best feeling. I want to say huge thank you to the whole government of Newfoundland, of St. John's, to give us the opportunity to come here, to start new life. Thank you so much.
It's definitely a stressful time for us. I can tell how hard it is for the people there in Ukraine. I'm from Kharkiv, Ukraine. It's like in the most eastern part, and like in crossfire from Donetsk, Lugansk, Belgorod. It's have been hit by the war for the whole time, and we left because of it.
I arrived in St. John's on June 14th by second charter flight from Warsaw. We were living in Bucha city. It's a suburban of the Kyiv, the capital city of Ukraine. And we were lucky because we left just 2 weeks before the invasion at the end of January. I'm helping the other families come here, and yes, that's great. That's maybe the best opportunities I ever had in my life.
Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe is promising action to protect Saskatchewan from what it says are destructive federal policies that could cost his province's economy $111 billion by the year 2035. The figure comes from a provincial analysis of 9 different federal climate change policies that was released by the government. Moe says Ottawa has been intruding into Saskatchewan's jurisdiction over natural resources under the guise of federal environmental regulations.
We firmly believe that when we have strong communities in Saskatchewan, that makes for a stronger province. We firmly believe that when we have a stronger province of Saskatchewan, it makes for a much stronger confederation and a much stronger nation of Canada. And so this isn't about what the federal government is doing. It isn't about Saskatchewan picking fights with the federal government. It's about Saskatchewan people and us working our level best to provide Saskatchewan people with an opportunity to achieve and to attain what we know is possible in the days ahead.
Moe says the province will introduce legislation to clarify and protect Saskatchewan's constitutional rights to maintain control over electricity, also emissions from fertilizer and oil and gas. The federal government is providing close to $1.7 million in funding over the next 5 years to support initiatives aimed at addressing discrimination of Métis people in Manitoba's justice system. Ottawa says the money will go to programs delivered through the Manitoba Métis Federation's Métis Justice Institute. Officials say the Institute provides programs and services seeking to reduce the number of Red River Métis people involved in the criminal justice system, also to prevent and reduce crime. Federal Justice Minister David Lametti says this should help improve fairness in Canada's justice system. Ottawa also announced $8 million in funding to begin the planning process for a new visitor reception and education centre in Banff. It says Parks Canada has worked over the past 25 years to obtain adjacent lands on Banff Avenue needed for the redevelopment. It says the planning process can begin right away and will include detailed studies of the site, along with engagement with Indigenous communities and stakeholders. Federal officials say the project will offer a gateway for meaningful connection to the iconic Banff National Park, which is the most visited national park in Canada. Lethbridge City Council, in an effort to attract more family physicians here to our city, approved a rezoning in the 900 block of 17th Avenue South. Officials say this will allow the redevelopment and development of a functional and modern building to provide medical office space close to the Chinook Regional Hospital. Last month, AHS announced that 17 family physicians have committed to Lethbridge and are awaiting their practice readiness assessments from the College of Physicians and Surgeons. A popular Lethbridge eatery has closed its doors. Mocha Cabana, which operated out of Lethbridge's historical Bell's Welding Building, ceased operations just after the Thanksgiving long weekend. In a notice posted on the door, they cite the pandemic and the current economic state that placed them at impossible odds to continue operating. The restaurant was well known for its fresh and local fare sourced from Southern Alberta farmers and producers. A collision between a car and a motorcycle in our city last week resulted in tragedy. Jake Legg was riding on his motorbike on October 4th and was heading southbound on Mayor McGrath Drive when he was struck at an intersection by a vehicle turning west on Scenic Drive. Legg was taken to hospital where he later died. A memorial service will be held and it'll be called the Ride for Jake. Legg's close friend Chris Yoakum says Legg was a one-of-a-kind individual who will be dearly missed.
You know, Jake was a son, a brother, a fiance, and Jake was also an uncle to 4 nephews and 4 nieces who they like to call Unky Jake. He liked to take him out on the acreage riding, and that was a fun bonding experience for them, of course. Jake actually was a tenant of my wife and I, and he was a great tenant with us and turned out to be a friend as well, until he moved on to his own house with him and his fiance. So yeah, Jake, that's how we met with Jake.
Now, 12:30 p.m. on Saturday, motorcyclists are encouraged to come down to the parking lot of the Old Montanas building on Mayor McGrath Drive for a final send-off ride for Legg. Students at Victoria Park High School in Lethbridge received a very nice gift. Churches from the Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Lethbridge got together to award the school with a $15,000 donation by way of a new SUV to help out with the new driver training program. Staff from the school and members of the LDS Church say the vehicle was much needed and will be used to help train students on the rules of road safety.
Can you remember when you were 14 or 16 and got started, and how exciting that is, and how that sort of gives you a hope and a vision for a better future and an exciting future? And so, as you can appreciate, you know, young people who don't have access to vehicles, who don't have access to training or getting a driver's license, that's a real limitation.
One really quick success story, we had a student drive it a number of hours over a 3-week period. He had some experience behind the wheel, but he really wanted to work on a couple of things. So he went out, targeted those specific skills, took the vehicle into the registry, did the road test in the vehicle he was used to, passed, and got his driver's license.
What a great initiative. The driver program will be run by community volunteers who can sign up through the school's online platform called Just Serve. The Blood Tribe is in discussions with the City of Lethbridge and the province to take over shelter operations of the Alpha House here in Lethbridge. Officials say the shelter services a large majority of Indigenous clients. Blood Tribe Department of Health Board member Charles Weaselhead says they're discussing short and long-term solutions to not only address homelessness in our city, but to also mitigate health and safety risks. Officials with the Blood Tribe say around 70% of the homeless who utilize the shelter are Indigenous. Representatives with 3 First Nations groups say a complaint has been filed against Indigenous Services Canada. The claim is adult members at Piikani, Siksika, and Kainai who live with developmental disabilities were discriminated against. The complaint references continued discrimination caused by ISC on the basis of race, ethnic origin, and disability. The claim also concludes that the federal government has failed to fund and support the services necessary to enable full participation in society for First Nations adults with disabilities. Now, in addition to compensation for each person, the claim will also be seeking funding for cultural programs. A new play in our city is weaving traditional Ukrainian folk music to tell the story of a woman who's taking care of her aging grandmother. It is the brainchild of a playwright who says she's been developing this show since 2017 after discovering her grandmother's journal that she wrote during the Second World War.
And I discovered this while the revolution of dignity was happening in Ukraine in 2014. And the sentiments that my Baba was sharing in her journal that she had written over 70 years ago were the same sentiments that people were sharing during the revolution in Ukraine today. And so I began writing a story that was reflecting on my Ukrainian-Canadian identity and my relationship with my Ukrainian grandmother. And to further develop this story, then I traveled to Ukraine in 2017, which was 3 years then after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Traveled all over the country to my ancestral homelands, my grandparents, and also within 5 kilometers of what was then the front line in eastern Ukraine to do interviews.
Those were some very cool looking instruments. By the way, the play will take place from October 13th to the 22nd at the Sterndale Bennett Theatre here in Lethbridge. Well, we had lots of cloud cover in our city today, but it appears as though the clouds will be leaving us. A full look at the weather forecast is coming up. Well, it was a fairly mild day across much of southwestern Alberta again today. Tonight in Lethbridge, it should be mainly clear with a low near -2. Thursday, lots of sunshine on tap with a high near 22. Friday, cooling off slightly with a daytime high near 19 expected. Saturday, cooler still with a high of only 17. The mercury should climb up to 23 on Sunday. A balmy 27 is in the forecast for Monday. Tuesday, cooling off slightly to 21 degrees. Now, the average high for this time of year is 15 degrees with an average low of +1. The record high was 29 set back in 1964, and the record low was -14 in 2002. The sun rose at 7:48 and set at 6:48, giving us 11 hours of daylight. Let's see how Thursday is looking across Canada now. In Victoria and Vancouver, it should be mainly sunny with a high of 19. Sunshine at 21 degrees is expected in Calgary on Thursday. Slightly warmer with a high of 22 for Edmonton. Sunshine, but only 12 is in the forecast for Regina. Sunny and 13 for Saskatoon. A good chance of showers developing and a high of only 7 degrees for Winnipeg on Thursday. Showers and 16 is in the forecast for Toronto. Rain and 18 for our nation's capital, Ottawa. Rain as well with a high of 21 degrees for Montreal. In Atlantic Canada, expect sunshine mixed with cloud and a high of 20 degrees for Fredericton. Overcast and 20 degrees as well for Halifax. Sunshine and clouds for Charlottetown and a high of 20. And at St. John's, Newfoundland, it should be mainly sunny with a high of 15 degrees on Thursday. Economists are saying Alberta's latest campaign to attract workers is a healthy way to promote competition. With labor shortages evident across the country, Alberta's targeting residents in Canada's most expensive cities, Vancouver and Toronto, with the Alberta is Calling campaign. The campaign pitches affordability, touting cheaper home prices and many job opportunities. Mike Moffat, an assistant professor at Western University's Ivey Business School, says it is smart for Alberta to flaunt what it has to offer. He does say, however, that a huge influx of new residents could drive up home prices if communities are not prepared for it. Canada Post is expanding pilot programs it launched last fall. It is offering loans alongside stamps and packaging as part of a partnership with TD Bank Group. It says the My Money program is designed to provide more financial options for Canadians, including in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. Customers can apply for personal loans starting at $1,000 either online or by phone, which have flexible repayment terms at TD interest rates. TikTok plans to operate warehouses in the United States similar to ones run by Walmart and Amazon. The social media platform, best known for addictive short videos, posted job listings on LinkedIn looking for people to develop and grow its Fulfillment by TikTok shop to accommodate sellers using the app. The listing suggests TikTok plans to provide warehousing, delivery, and item return options to sellers. The company has not officially commented. Insider intelligence reports that shopping on social media sites known as social commerce is a $37 billion market in the U.S., led by Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was down 10 points on the day to finish at 18,206. The Dow was down 28 points to 29,210. The S&P 500 was down 11 points on the day to 3577, and the Nasdaq was down 9 points to 10,417. West Texas Intermediate Oil was down 233 to 87.02 US per barrel. Natural gas was down 15 cents to 6.45 US. Gold was up 3 cents to 1673.22 US an ounce, and silver was even on the day at 19.02 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $12.52 per bushel, barley's at $9.69, canola's at $19.80, and corn is at $12.32 per bushel. Live cattle were up 38 cents to $146.18, feeder cattle were up 43 cents to $175.50, and lean hogs were down 8 cents to $93.10. The Canadian dollar was up slightly over the past 24 hours to 72.39 US. Recapping one of our top stories, Elections Alberta has called a by-election for November 8th in Brooks Medicine Hat. That's the constituency where Premier Danielle Smith says she intends to seek a seat. Smith, who succeeded Jason Kenney as leader of the UCP, does not yet have a seat at the legislature. Brooks Medicine Hat became vacant when the current representative, Michaela Fry, resigned on Friday. The next provincial election is slated for May the 29th. You know, there's a lot of talk of Danielle Smith invoking the Alberta Sovereignty Act now that she's premier. Will she actually follow through with it? Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson will give us his thoughts next. Listen, if you see news happening in your community, be sure to send us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. We'd love to hear from you.
Here's today's Bridge City News community calendar. Fort Whoop Up is bringing Spooky back with their family-friendly Spooktober event taking place October 29th and 30th from 1 to 5 p.m. Enjoy an afternoon of creating spooky crafts, live blacksmithing, fun games, Halloween candy, and more. Registration is required. Fort admission prices applies, and membership holders can enter for free. For details and to register, visit galtmuseum.com. Celebrate Recovery is a Christ-centered recovery program for any hurt, hang-up, and habit. This group meets Friday nights at Park Meadows Baptist Church. The evening begins at 7 p.m. with a large group session, followed by small groups at 8 with coffee and dessert at 9. For more information, visit celebraterecovery.ca or call Park Meadows Church office at 403-327-4422. And that's today's Bridge City News community calendar.
Danielle Smith is the new Premier of Alberta, and there was a little bit of controversy surrounding one of her first media avails, press conferences, since becoming the new leader of the UCP. Smith called unvaccinated people the most discriminated against group that she's witnessed in her lifetime. Now, to chat about this in a little more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, many who remain unvaxxed agree with the Premier. They're saying, yeah, go Danielle. But then other groups such as our First Nations are saying, hey, what about us?
Yeah, you know, it didn't make it very long into being Premier before there was a little bit of controversy, that's for sure. The New Democrats obviously have absolutely pounced on this over the last little bit here and talking about it pretty much constantly. You know, a Jewish organization in Edmonton has reached out to the Premier's office to express its concerns and sort of revisit the need for Holocaust education in the province and things like that. So obviously Danielle Smith rode a wave to power that was in large part sort of fueled by the sentiment of the unvaccinated and concerns over how the unvaccinated were treated. But this, I think, is fairly clearly an early sort of misstep. Obviously, there are people who agree with her, people who disagree with her, but I don't know if that's exactly how a person wants to start their very first day as Premier, sort of on the back foot a little bit over some of these comments. So we'll have to see how this shakes out. We'll have to see if there's an apology. We'll have to see if she clarifies these remarks in the days ahead. But a bit of a starting out with a bang, I guess you could say, in her tenure as Premier.
Now, Danielle Smith says her party is united as the UCP prepares for the next provincial election in the spring. Tyler, do you think she'll still move forward with the Alberta Sovereignty Act, or maybe kind of back off a little bit?
Well, that's a really good question, because it actually seemed when she was talking to reporters on Tuesday that she was backing off a little bit. She did say that Supreme Court decisions would be respected, which is certainly not the sort of tone that she had struck over the last few months on the campaign trail. So I think we'll very much have to see what comes of that. This was the other, this was sort of a two-sided wave that brought her to the Premier's office, was the vaccine thing and the treatment of Alberta by Ottawa thing. So if she softens her stance on this, if she backs off on this policy that a lot of the party base really, really liked, she's going to find herself potentially in a similar position that Jason Kenney did. So at this point, the signal seems to be that she's softening her stance a little bit. But of course, she has said in recent weeks that she was going to have to consult with caucus on how to make it happen. She had promised that it was actually going to be compliant with the Constitution and things like that, which probably necessitated at some point a little bit of softening of the rhetoric. So obviously we haven't seen text of the bill yet. We haven't seen even a draft or anything like that. But I would say early indications are that she has softened her stance just a little bit on this.
So Smith has talked a lot about unifying the party, being a big tent party, similar to what the federal Conservatives have talked about in the past. But what's going to become of Brian Jean and Travis Taves now that they lost the leadership to Danielle Smith?
Yeah, another really good question. The question for sure with Travis Taves is whether or not he's going to stick around. He did not commit to sticking around if he lost when he was asked during the leadership race. There hasn't been an indication yet of what his decision is. I suspect Brian Jean is sticking around. I suspect we will see him in cabinet in a couple weeks here when cabinet is finally announced. Likely similar for some of the other folks who ran against Danielle Smith, Rebecca Schultz and Rajan Sani, the two that leap immediately to mind. Perhaps Todd Lowen will be in cabinet. He's certainly back in caucus. We saw him in a photo last week of the entire sort of UCP caucus, and he was in that photo. Drew Barnes, I should point out, from down your way, is not back in caucus just yet. But I suspect most of them will be sticking around. The two, I think, that we don't know what exactly is going to happen is Jason Kenney and Travis Taves.
Now, Danielle Smith does not have a seat at the legislature, Tyler, but will run in a by-election in Brooks Medicine Hat on, I think it's November the 8th. Smith was originally from Calgary. Why not run in the Calgary-Elbow riding, which was Doug Schweitzer's old riding?
Well, there's a risk, frankly, that she would lose in that riding. I think this is also Ralph Klein's old riding, if I'm not mistaken. But, there is the risk that Danielle Smith's sort of politics are a little bit too far to the right for a Calgary riding. There is the risk that the NDP run a really, really, really strong campaign. And obviously that would be a terrible start to her time as premier if she was to lose a by-election. And she has also signaled, sort of a shift towards more rural dominance in the government and in the caucus, in cabinet. So that might be another reason why she's choosing to run in the Medicine Hat area. But certainly that's the safest possible sort of area for her to run at the moment, I think. And that probably explains it more than anything. Not that will be all that much comfort to the folks of Calgary Elbow who won't have a representative for the next 6 months or so.
Yeah, and Smith says the Calgary Elbow riding may remain vacant until after the next election. Is this quite common when it comes to provincial politics?
No, it's not. Usually you would sort of have all these things at the same time, because 6 months is sort of a long time to not have someone in the legislature. So, from a tactical point of view, the UCP or Smith might not want to run a by-election if they're concerned about losing. The way she sort of explained this is that she spoke to the party's grassroots folks in the riding, and they want to be able to have, a proper search for a candidate and that sort of race for nomination race. That's the word I'm looking for, nomination, and that they need time to do that. And so they're not going to call an immediate by-election there. This is atypical. There are people down there from media reports who are not very happy about this. Again, the NDP hammering away on this, saying that, this is a threat to democracy in the province. These people are not going to have a representative in the legislature. We could see that change. Maybe there will be a by-election before the next election, but I think pretty much all observers thinking this is a bit of a strange decision.
Tyler, let's circle back to what you're mentioning earlier about the rural theme when it comes to the makeup of the UCP and cabinet here. Premier Smith says her cabinet, which will be sworn in a couple of weeks, will be rural in makeup and thinking. Now, the vast majority of Albertans I know live in some of the big cities. Are the party's priorities maybe shifting somewhat?
Well, it's tough to say. I mean, I think probably yes. There's a bit of a discrepancy or disparity between the membership of the United Conservative Party and the province as a whole. And what I mean by that is that membership in the party is pretty heavily skewed towards rural and small town Alberta, whereas I think something like 80% of Albertans live in sort of large municipalities, and the vast majority of that in Edmonton and Calgary. So there was sort of this quip about the United Conservatives under Jason Kenney that the cabinet was basically full of people from Calgary. Of course, the UCP only has one MLA in Edmonton, for example, and that's Casey Madhu, the former Justice Minister, now Labor Minister, if I'm not mistaken. So there does seem to be this shift towards rural Alberta, which sort of makes sense considering the party's base, considering the support that Danielle Smith has. The risk for her, politically speaking, is that the bulk of the province's voters are not in these areas. And so what sort of support does that translate into in the next general election?
Yeah, you think they would focus a lot of their attention on Edmonton. As you said, only one MLA in our provincial capital, so why not put a lot of your focus there right now?
Sure, or even in some of the suburban and urban ridings in Calgary that are going to be these battleground ridings. I think if you sort of look at the math and assume the UCP is going to sweep small town and rural Alberta, if the UCP plays it safe and assumes the New Democrats are going to sweep Edmonton, then they really need to put their focus on some of these ridings in Calgary that are going to be tough for them to win, and a couple of ridings in Lethbridge. And it does seem like that's where the attention ought to go. But, early days, new teams are coming in, new staff coming in, new priorities. So a lot of this stuff, I think, reporters tend to show up and ask about X, Y, Z and assume that there's going to be an answer available, right there and then. But I do think we'll see some of this stuff sort of shake out in the weeks and months ahead.
Now, there's some rumors and rumblings here in Lethbridge that the UCP is going to bring forth one or even two potential star candidates to go up against Shanna Phillips, the Lethbridge West MLA. With the NDP right now. What are you hearing?
I haven't heard much about star candidates, and I think that one of the challenges for a star candidate is that until last week, we didn't know who the leader of the UCP was going to be. So finding a star, if you're a star candidate, do you want to run under Danielle Smith, or would you have preferred to run under Travis Taves or Brian Jean? I think certainly they will try and find some of these candidates. Lethbridge makes a lot of sense. I think some of these Calgary ridings make sense. Possibly a couple of ridings in the Edmonton area might make sense to catapult some of these people in for some star power. But I haven't heard much yet about who some of these people might be. And of course, the other issue here is that there's been a lot of controversy in Conservative Party circles, both federally and provincially, when leaders do bring in these star candidates and disrupt sort of the grassroots nomination process. They say, we don't want Joe, the local shop owner. We have this great business person who's going to come in and run for us. And that's led to a lot of controversy over the years. So there is a bit of a tension there between the desire for a star candidate and what the local sort of constituency association grassroots members are wanting. So another potential little landmine for the Smith team if they decide to go about this.
Premier Smith said that Dr. Dina Hinshaw is out as our province's Chief Medical Officer of Health, and she's also vowing to restructure AHS. Tyler, what will that really look like?
Well, firing Dina Hinshaw is the sort of more straightforward of the two, I think we can say. Finding a replacement might be a little trickier, but that part of it, I think, is relatively straightforward. But, she said that she's going to restructure AHS by the end of the year, which is not that far away. And so, what is there to say? I think it's sort of anyone's guess how that's going to be accomplished on such a short time frame and what that's going to look like. Because, of course, the province has reorganized AHS a couple times before, going from centralized boards to decentralized to re-centralized and things like that. So we don't actually know a whole ton about what that might look like beyond some of the promises that she made in the leadership race, to clear out the board of AHS and the board of Alberta Health, for example. So those are some of the concrete things we might see. But, in terms of what that might actually look like, I just don't think we know yet, and it's very hard to imagine how that's going to happen on such a short time frame. So I think that's going to be something that reporters are watching very, very carefully, and that the New Democrats are going to be watching very, very carefully, because they would love to have a fight about healthcare. Their polling internally always shows that that's a sort of a bread and butter issue for Albertans. So that is a fight that they are certainly more than willing to take to Danielle Smith should that happen.
We're also watching quite closely the potential of decentralizing EMS dispatch so that municipalities will be given the power once again to bring in ambulances and not have to worry about the centralized, where a lot of mayors, including our mayor here in Lethbridge, is quite concerned about the time it's taking and the length of these ambulances to get to certain situations. What are you hearing right now in Edmonton?
Well, that's one of the strange things too, is that this leadership race was so heavily dominated by talking about COVID and talking about the Sovereignty Act that we didn't get a lot of answers about some of these things. A really similar example is the Alberta Provincial Police thing, which Danielle Smith has said she supports, but does not seem to support eliminating the RCMP entirely. And I was actually just clicking back through my emails before we had this chat, and there hasn't been any sort of policy emails or anything from the Alberta government news offices yet. So we're in sort of this void, I guess, where we actually just simply don't know what's happening on some of these fronts. So again, should shake out in some of the weeks ahead, but it is a bit of a strange time because we simply don't have answers to a lot of these things.
Yeah, another big point too was the Alberta pension plan, opting out of the Canada pension plan, and we're going to protect Albertans' money here, and we haven't heard much of that either, have we?
No, I'm tempted to say that I think Danielle Smith supports that idea, but I don't want to say that for sure. Certainly some of the other candidates have talked favorably about that. This is a big question, to what extent is the mandate that the UCP was elected on in 2019 the mandate that Danielle Smith is still sort of following? We had the Fair Deal panel. All these policy ideas came out, including the pension plan, including the police force. They've been endorsed in that sense by the party and by the party's membership. But is Danielle Smith going to take the party down that road? Is the convention going to give us some clues, I guess, to what's going to happen? It's a very strange sort of time. And, I wasn't here for some of the last sort of strange transitions, in the Redford years and stuff like that. But to me, it's just sort of a very odd period of time.
I'm glad you brought up the conventions. Both the UCP and NDP conventions are coming up. What can we really look forward to seeing at both?
Well, I think the NDP, what we're going to be looking for is a sense of how they are going to be taking the fight to the UCP. I think healthcare is going to be a big one. I think education is going to be a big one. I think inflation is going to be a big thing that they're talking about. That's another example of something that didn't come up in the leadership as much as maybe we would have expected. These are very top of mind priorities according to all of the polling that's been done. So I think really we're going to see what the NDP's sort of attack lines are going to be. On the UCP side, I think the question is going to be just how united is this United Conservative Party? The party has doubled in size in the past 6 months. You have a lot of new members who've never been involved in party politics before. A lot of them are Danielle Smith supporters. A lot of them, I think it's fair to say, tack a little bit further to the political right than some of the sort of legacy members of the party, particularly from the progressive conservative days. So, I'm going to be looking quite carefully at what the policy resolutions are. And there's also usually elections at the convention for board memberships and things like that. And there was an attempt at the last one from the people who wanted Jason Kenney gone. They tried to take over the party board in these elections, and they failed, actually. So I expect that we'll see maybe a house cleaning, maybe not. Maybe these mainstream progressive conservative types that have been around for a long time are still going to hold on to some of these key positions. Or maybe they won't. So I think what everyone's going to be looking for at this convention is just where this party is going, just how these new members are being folded into the party, what direction it's going to take. And for the NDP, I think it's very much just sort of they're going to rally behind Rachel Notley. They're going to hash out their battle lines. They are, I suspect, going to move a little bit to the center on some policy ideas to be a little more palatable, perhaps, to some of those Calgary voters we talked about earlier. Lots to watch, and they're in different places. I think the NDP are in Calgary and the UCP is in Edmonton, and so I wish I could be in two places at once, that's for sure.
And when are they taking place?
I believe it's the weekend of the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, so that's like less than 2 weeks away, I think.
Yeah, just around the corner. He's the Alberta correspondent for the National Post and our legislative reporter, Tyler Dawson. Thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Always a pleasure, Hal.
Climate change has become one of the biggest concerns in most nations around the world, with hundreds of billions of tax dollars being spent on reducing carbon emissions. Recently, some governments are trying to force farmers to reduce cattle production and reduce the use of fertilizers in the fight against climate change. So how many of these efforts to protect our environment actually are making a difference? Joining us today from London, Ontario to discuss this further is Dr. Christopher Essex, Emeritus Professor of Physics and Mathematics at the University of Western Ontario and co-author of Taken by Storm, the Troubled Science, Policy, and Politics of Global Warming. That is such a mouthful. Welcome to Bridge City News, Professor Essex.
Thank you for having me. Yes, okay.
Absolutely. Okay, you got quite the background there with math and physics. That's way beyond the scope of anything that I'm capable of doing.
It's okay. I won't hurt anybody.
That's okay. Okay, so one of your articles on the CornwallAlliance.com website is entitled Virtue Science Reigns. So how would you define virtue science?
Well, first of all, you need to, well, there are a lot of things. You said something about carbon production that immediately brought in the issue of the distinction between science and what people are doing that they call science. We're kind of doing politics and we're calling it science. The science gets meshed in with everything, and a common view is to think of science as a kind of substitute for religion, which it's not. And it's a very different way of thinking, different than the way many people think. And instead of going around thinking like that you have all the answers, you think you actually are a fallible human being, and you only through much struggle figure out what the answers are. And that's a very different way of looking at things. You don't just believe that the answers are something. You have to actually prove it. Test it, show me. That's what science is really about. And so when scientists are minding their own business and they fight among themselves, they argue and they think the other ones are kind of, well, those crazy people over there, they don't know what they're talking about, and that kind of thing. And then they think the same about you, right? And so, but that's the kind of, and everyone kind of grudgingly knows that sometimes you get really heated about it, but it's still just science.
Show Big Bang Theory right away with all the scientists.
Those
egos
are my people.
Get in the way.
Those are my people. I understand them. That's right. No, I understand that very well. But when they're left to their own devices, they're pretty good. They're fine. But then some external power comes in with lots of money and prestige and recognition, and it starts picking and choosing which particular faction in the scientific disputes is the one that they're going to promote. And that's kind of what we've been living through. We've been living through this world where people have a kind of an image in their minds, and they try to impose that on the world. So they're violating the basic scientist's idea that, well, we can be fooled very easily in the natural world. No, they know what the answers are, and they then choose some scientist who agrees with them or some group of scientists, and then they reward them, and the other scientists basically are driven off, and you never hear of them again. And I'm kind of in the latter category. I've never heard from again. So I don't usually discuss this stuff. I just, sometimes I've been at this for so long, I feel kind of like it's a futile gesture. So I kind of have given up on a lot of this stuff. I think I've been arguing these points for too long in many cases, but you could see it in your presentation when you were talking about carbon, and the whole excitement about climate change and so forth had to do not with carbon, but carbon dioxide. So you need a carbon atom and then two oxygen atoms together in order to have the effect. Carbon by itself doesn't do anything. The whole greenhouse thing is that the oxygen molecules vibrate up and down, and they oscillate and they vibrate, and that's what causes them to absorb radiation in infrared light. And if you take the oxygen off, it's just nonsense. I mean, at that point, well, they did the same thing with nitrogen. The nitrogen all by itself doesn't really do anything greenhouse wise, but if you put oxygen onto it, you have different versions of nitrogen oxides, but The one they're particularly interested in is nitrous oxide, which is two nitrogens and oxygen.
Let me ask you this. So Dutch farmers have been protesting their government's plan to force farmers to drastically reduce that nitrogen emission by reducing the use of fertilizer. So government officials are insisting that this will help save the planet from the effects of climate change. So can you tell us if this is good science, or is this what some refer to as this virtue science?
Well, I coined this term virtue science because it's somehow a weird mixture of what the facts are and morality, right? So you don't just get to talk about, list the scientific facts and then discuss morality. No, somehow it becomes a question of what you are saying scientifically becomes a moral view, and so you can't really go in a scientific way and ask for input from lots of viewpoints, and then now you have all the facts on the table. Now let's make a decision. It's more that something is just asserted, and so that's what. And when you're wrong about this, which you can be wrong in science all the time. I can be wrong. Everyone can be wrong. You're not just wrong. You're worse than wrong because you're immoral, right? So that's the idea. And so the whole Dutch farmer thing, I feel very sorry for them. I feel bad about they're trying to do this with Canadian farmers as well. Trying to say that because nitrous oxide absorbs in the infrared, that somehow it has a cumulative effect with all the other gases that absorb in the infrared. And it doesn't work that way. That's not the way a radiative transfer problem works.
Okay, so hypothetically, if the government of Canada were to ban cattle and completely ban all fertilizer use, how much of an impact would this have on our environment?
Environment is a kind of vague word, but in terms of the actual greenhouse thing, I don't think it would make much difference at all, because you can take nitrous oxide and put it in or take it out of a model, and it won't make much difference because water molecules are far more important than all those other ones together. And the only reason why we even talk about CO2, not carbon, CO2, is because its 15 micron band lines up with a small hole in the very intense water vapor spectrum in the infrared. And so if that hole wasn't there, you probably would have never heard of carbon dioxide. So water vapor basically dominates everything else. So if you put nitrous oxide in or take it out of an actual radiative convective model, which I have done, it doesn't really make any difference. And the same thing with methane, which is CH4. There's no water vapor window for cow farts, as I said in this article. So I don't see that there's any. This is really about morality more than about actual science. And I looked at someone referred to the Canadian government website, and they're talking about it. And they're talking about the individual molecules and the number of molecules and everything. And that's totally irrelevant. It's a question of what region of the infrared spectrum that it occupies. And so this just doesn't do anything.
Yeah, so often we hear media outlets quoting government officials and scientists saying that there is consensus on climate change, which makes it sound like it must be factual. So does consensus actually mean that these opinions are clear empirical facts?
Well, there are many, many problems with this claim about consensus and the science. Well, I've tried to explain a little bit of the way science works in the real world, as opposed to what's represented on the press. There's the science in the press, the consensus and so on. But when it comes to anything that is in the domain of research, which is also something people aren't familiar with, they tend to think that all knowledge is available, everyone and everything is known, and there's just somebody who knows it. But there's a whole world which many people are unfamiliar with, and I've spent most of my life in, is a domain beyond what anybody knows. There's no expert in what these areas are that I've worked in. That's research. That's what research is about. It's about what nobody knows. There are no experts in that field because nobody's figured any of that stuff out. And there's a huge boundary of the unknown in the world. We haven't gotten rid of that. It's profound and amazing and wonderful. And for anyone who wants to have a career in research, there's tons to figure out, and there's this is way beyond us. And yeah, so.
When well-qualified scientists share their views on climate change or even COVID vaccines, who happen to disagree with the current government opinion, these scientists tend to get ostracized, right? We've seen it over
Well,
and
they
over
become
again.
disappeared, right? I
Yes.
mean, you just don't hear of them, and you can see that going on with the COVID business. You know, it's, as I said, they're not just wrong; they're worse than wrong. So they become immoral,
But
right?
isn't
So,
scientific debate and disagreement normally a good thing? 'Cause this is kind of
what is causing a lot of the problems we have right now, where we have these policies which are, I think, bordering on insanity. They're just kind of driven by people feeling that this is the right thing to do. By golly, we've got to do it right away. You know, that kind of mentality. The reason why this stuff exists is that we're not really ever giving the science a reflection of its unsettled kind of nature. So you don't get to give a fair hearing to any scientist but the ones that happen to be just promoting your particular political agenda. And that, I think, is the heart of the problem here. And actually, George Orwell had a really good thing. He said, anyone who challenges the prevailing orthodoxy, this is just common for human beings, finds himself silenced with surprising effectiveness. A genuinely unfashionable opinion is almost never given a fair hearing, either in the popular press or in the highbrow periodicals. And I've certainly experienced that over my career, and I definitely have seen the medical community experiencing that now, and so on, because people get caught up in a fashion, and they can't open their minds long enough to actually listen to the range of views. And one of the suggestions that myself and my co-author for the book you mentioned, Ross McKitterick, have suggested is that it's really obvious. You could create two teams, one team saying one thing, saying the other team saying the opposite, make their case, and then they swap explanations, and each does a critique of the other person's or other faction's views. Take all four of them, staple them together, and then give them to the governments, and then they can make their policy out of that. But instead, what the policy becomes primary, and technicalities become secondary. So we talk about carbon instead of carbon dioxide. We talk about nitrogen instead of nitrous oxide in this case. And you can see the weird way this goes, because H2O, which is water, we could say, if we drop the oxygen, we could say that the oceans are made out of hydrogen. You know, I mean, it would be the same logic, right? I mean, but we don't do that because water is not something that has to do with morality. It's not something that capitalism is creating or something like that. So we don't drop the oxygen there. Yeah. So it's really weird.
Yeah, it is. Like, this is kind of a loaded question, but we keep hearing reports that global temperatures keep rising and that this will have dire consequences for our planet. That's very serious, but is it true? And how exactly do we measure global temperature?
Well, first of all, you can't measure something that doesn't really exist physically. I mean, the system is not in thermodynamic equilibrium. So measuring temperature other than in an extremely coarse way, say comparing it to the temperature of the sun or something like that, well, yeah, okay, it's not as hot as that. But if you're talking about changes of tenths of a degree against something that's varying by, I don't know, 80 degrees from coldest to hottest, it's a kind of a silly thing. And so what you're really doing is statistics rather than thermodynamics. And you can't, since it is a statistical trend. Another way to look at this, which I think is maybe even more effective, the temperature that's used in real physics is not degrees Celsius or changes in degrees Celsius. It's something called temperature in units of Kelvin compared to absolute zero. And those are the things that go into the physics formulas. And if you do some kind of clever way of mapping all the wonderful temperatures in the IPCC outputs, with small trends of 0.3 degrees and 0.2 degrees and so on, and you put it on a Kelvin scale, then what you get is something's not changing at all. It's completely flat. You can't see the changes. Even if I were to take these changes and put it on a regular mercury thermometer, you would, over the past 20 or 30 degrees, and you put it on that thermometer, and you line up all the thermometers, or pictures of them before and after, you wouldn't be able to see the difference because that only measures every 2 degrees, right? So you wouldn't even see the changes that have happened. So in many respects, this is an extremely naive way of looking at it. And there's a reason historically why it came out that way, because in the 1960s, the models on computers were so simple, which is something I was doing, that you only had one temperature in the entire system to talk about. And for some reason, which is very non-scientific, this got mapped onto these complex models. And so instead of discussing the complex models as complex things, they average them all and then they try to make it a simplistic temperature again. And you can have climate change without any change in this average temperature at all. So you could have zero change in average temperature, but you could still get climate change. So it's because there's a lot more to climate than just temperature. So that's
fascinating stuff. Absolutely. It looks like we are about out of time, but thanks so much for being with us today, Dr. Essex.
Okay, my pleasure. Okay.
I appreciate having you on. Dr. Christopher Essex is Emeritus Professor of Physics and Mathematics at the University of Western Ontario and co-author of Taken by Storm, The Troubled Science, Policy, and Politics of Global Warming. There you go. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks for watching.